You know something I think all of us are good at? Explaining ourselves. We can explain why we got angry. We can explain why we quit. We can explain why we went back. We can explain why we didn't follow through. We can explain why we treated somebody the way we did. We can explain why we're still in the same situation we've been complaining about for the last 3 years. And sometimes those explanations are completely true. Maybe you did have a difficult childhood. Maybe somebody did hurt you. Maybe you didn't have the opportunities someone else had. Maybe you were surrounded by the wrong people. Maybe you went through something that completely changed the way you looked at life. I'm not saying those things don't matter, because they do. But here's where I think we get ourselves in trouble. At some point, an explanation can become an excuse. And sometimes the excuse sounds so reasonable that we don't even recognize it as one. So that's what I want to talk about today. Not whether you have reasons for being the way you are. You probably do. The question is, are those reasons helping you understand yourself? Or are you using them to avoid changing yourself? I think that's the first thing people need to understand. Most excuses don't sound ridiculous. That's why they're effective. Nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to completely ruin my own progress today for absolutely no reason. There's usually a story attached to it. I've been working all week. I deserve this. They disrespected me. Nobody ever helped me. I've always been this way. I didn't have a father. I didn't have a mother. I grew up around this. My last relationship messed me up. I don't trust anybody because of what happened before. Now, those things may be true. And I think this is where accountability gets misunderstood. Accountability doesn't require you to lie about what happened to you. You don't have to pretend somebody didn't hurt you. You don't have to pretend you had a perfect childhood. You don't have to pretend your circumstances didn't affect you. Of course they affected you. The problem starts when you take something that explains your behavior and you use it as permission to continue the behavior. That's completely different. There's a difference between saying, I struggle with trust because I've been betrayed, and saying, because I've been betrayed, I have the right to treat everybody like they're going to betray me. One is understanding yourself. The other one is protecting a pattern. And if you keep protecting the pattern, why would it ever change? Your story matters. I built Corrections Reflections around the belief that people's experiences matter. I believe people need places where they can talk honestly about what they've lived through. But there's another side to that. You can understand your story and still stay stuck in it. You can talk about what happened to you for 20 years and never ask what you're doing today. That's where reflection has to eventually turn into responsibility. Because there comes a point where the question can't only be, what happened to me? Eventually, you've got to ask, what am I going to do because of what happened to me? That's a harder question. Because now we're not talking about somebody else's decisions. We're talking about yours. Maybe what happened wasn't your decision. Maybe what you're doing today might be. And those two things can exist at the same time. You can have compassion for who you were while still demanding more from who you are now. Here's something I want you to start listening for in your own conversations. Listen to what you say after the word, because. I can't do that because. I reacted that way because. I didn't show up because. I haven't started because. I went back because. I quit because. Sometimes there's a legitimate reason. I'm not saying every because is an excuse. But if the same explanation keeps showing up and the same result keeps showing up, you need to pay attention. Because maybe the explanation isn't helping you anymore. Maybe it's keeping you comfortable. That's one of the hardest things about accountability. Sometimes you've got to question your own story. Not because the story isn't true, but because the way you're using it might be hurting you. And that's a completely different conversation. Blame is easy because blame gives us somewhere to put everything. It's their fault, my parents' fault, my ex's fault, my boss's fault, the system's fault, my friend's fault. And sometimes somebody else absolutely did contribute to the situation. But here's the problem. If another person is responsible for everything that's wrong with your life, then who has to change before your life gets better? They do. Think about that. You've just handed them control. Now your peace depends on their apology. Your growth depends on them changing. Your future depends on them finally understanding what they did. What happens if they never do? What happens if they never apologize? What happens if they never admit they were wrong? Are you going to stay the same for the next 20 years waiting on them? That's why ownership is powerful. Ownership doesn't mean everything was my fault. Ownership means, regardless of whose fault it was, I'm responsible for what I do next. That's power. Because now you don't have to wait for anybody. A lot of people have good intentions. They mean it when they say, I'm done. They mean it when they say, I'm gonna change. They mean it when they say, I'm never going back. I've meant it before. I'm sure you have too. But your life doesn't respond to what you meant to do. It responds to what you repeatedly do. That's why I think patterns tell us more about our lives than promises do. If I tell you I'm gonna wake up early every morning, but every morning I hit snooze, which one is telling the truth? My words or my pattern? If I tell you I'm done with the relationship, but every time that person calls, I answer, what's telling the truth? If I tell you I'm going to control my anger, but every time somebody challenges me, I explode, what's telling the truth? Your intentions tell me what you want. Your patterns tell me what you're practicing. And eventually, what you practice becomes what people experience from you. Anybody can make a decision when it's easy. That's not really where discipline gets tested. Discipline gets tested when you've got a perfectly good excuse not to do what you said you were going to do. You're tired. You're frustrated. You had a bad day. Nobody's watching. You don't feel like it. You can always start tomorrow. That's the moment. Because discipline isn't, I always feel motivated. Discipline is, I know exactly why I don't want to do this right now, and I'm going to do it anyways. That's a completely different mindset. And I think that's why people struggle with consistency. They're waiting to feel like the person they want to become before they actually start acting like that person. Sometimes you've got to reverse it. Act like the person you're trying to become, especially when you don't feel like it. That's how you start proving something different to yourself. I think we negotiate with ourselves way too much. Just today. One more time. I'll start Monday. I'll handle it next month. I'll stop after this. And every time you negotiate with the behavior you're trying to leave behind, you're keeping it involved in your life. Imagine trying to leave a relationship while constantly asking that person whether they're okay with you leaving. You never get out. But we do that with our own habits all the time. We ask the old version of ourselves for permission to become somebody different. And of course, that version of you doesn't want to go anywhere. It's familiar. It knows the routine. It knows the excuses. It knows how to get comfortable. So eventually, you've got to stop negotiating. There are decisions in your life that need to become, this is what I do now. And there are other decisions that need to become, I don't do that anymore. Not because you're perfect, but because you're trying to establish a different standard. This one is difficult. Sometimes you start changing and the people around you don't. And that's when you find out who was connected to you and who was connected to the version of you that benefited them. Maybe you stopped drinking. Now certain people don't call you as much. Maybe you start taking your future seriously. Now somebody says, you think you're better than everybody. Maybe you stop participating in drama. Now you're acting different. Well, maybe you are acting different. I mean, wasn't that the point? You said you wanted a different life. Why would you expect to behave exactly the same? Sometimes growth creates distance. Not because you hate anybody, not because you think you're better, but because you're realizing that you can't keep feeding every environment that fed the old version of you. And that can be uncomfortable, but sometimes uncomfortable is exactly where you need to be. This is one of the biggest questions I think a person can ask themselves. Who are you when nobody checks? When there's no mentor, no boss, no probation officer, no spouse asking questions, no parent watching, no friend calling you out, just you. What happens then? Because eventually, accountability has to become internal. Other people can help you. They can challenge you. They can point things out. They can ask you questions. That's part of why we built the Guilty of Change mentorship programs. But nobody can follow you around every hour of every day making your decisions for you. Eventually, you have to become somebody who can tell yourself the truth. You have to be able to catch your own excuse. You have to recognize your own pattern. You have to say, nobody would know if I did this, but I would. That's character. And I think some of the biggest changes in a person's life happen in moments nobody else ever sees. Sometimes people make change way too big. They look at everything that's wrong and think, I've got to fix my whole life. No, you don't. You probably can't fix your whole life today. But you can make one decision today that doesn't make tomorrow worse. That's a start. Maybe today you don't call that person. Maybe today you don't spend the money. Maybe today you go home instead of going somewhere you know you shouldn't be. Maybe today you actually do what you said you were going to do. Maybe today you tell somebody the truth. Maybe today you stop blaming somebody for something you've had the power to address for years. One decision, then another, and then another. People want transformation to feel dramatic. A lot of the time, it probably looks boring. It's somebody quietly making a better decision over and over again. Nobody's clapping. Nobody's posting about it. Nobody even knows. But 6 months later, their life looks different. This is where I want you to really think. Because excuses always have a price. Maybe the price is your relationship. Maybe it's your health. Maybe it's your money. Maybe it's opportunities. Maybe it's trust. Maybe it's your kids watching you say one thing and do another. Maybe it's your own confidence. Because every time you tell yourself, I'm going to do this, and then you don't, you're teaching yourself something. You're teaching yourself that your own word doesn't mean very much. You do that enough times, and eventually you stop trusting yourself. That's why following through matters beyond the actual task. You're rebuilding trust with yourself. You're proving, when I say I'm going to do something, I'm becoming somebody who does it. That's worth something. So now let's bring all of this together. Forget who you've been for a minute. Who are you actually trying to become? Not what do you want to have, but who do you want to be? Dependable? Disciplined? Present? Honest? Calm? A better parent? A better partner? Someone who finishes what they start? Someone people can trust? Okay, now here's the harder question. What excuse does that person have to stop making? Because you can't keep every excuse from your old life and expect to build a completely different one. Something has to go. Maybe it's blame. Maybe it's procrastination. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's always needing someone else to validate you. Maybe that's just how I am. Whatever it is, you probably already know. And once you know, now you've got a decision to make. I think that's really what accountability comes down to. Not pretending life was fair. Not pretending people didn't hurt you. Not pretending your past didn't shape you. Because it did. And some of those experiences may explain exactly why you learned to think, react, or behave the way you did. But understanding where something came from doesn't mean you have to keep carrying it. At some point, you've got to decide what still belongs in your life and what doesn't. Because you can't control everything that happened before today. But you do have a say in what you keep repeating tomorrow. And that's the difference. Your past explains you. It doesn't excuse you. And you don't have to spend the rest of your life proving your old excuses right.